On that evening, 5 close friends, Luke, Hutch, Dom, Phil, and Robert, were hanging out at a bar. They had been tight since college, and their friendship was like that of brothers. They were discussing various things, including their vacation plans. Rob suggested they take a trip together to hike the King's Trail on the Swedish border. Naturally, his friends weren't keen on the idea, saying they were too old for that. After leaving the bar, Luke suggested they stop by a store to buy some alcohol. They had no idea this decision would change their lives forever. Since no one else wanted to go, Rob went with Luke into the store. Unfortunately, a robbery was taking place inside. Luke managed to hide while Rob was confronted by the robbers. Rob handed over his money and watch, but refused to give up his wedding ring. Luke, torn between staying hidden and helping Robert, was paralyzed by indecision. In the end, one of the robbers beat Rob to death, while Luke remained frozen in fear. 6 months later, to honor Rob's last wishes, the 4 friends set out on a hike along the King's Trail in Sarek National Park, northern Sweden. The trail was stunning, with grassy meadows nestled between towering snow-capped mountains and dense forests. When they reached the peak, they held a small ceremony to remember Rob, leaving behind items that reminded them of him. Since it was already night, they decided to camp there. Rob's death left Luke with a lot of regret and guilt. Hutch tried to reassure Luke that Rob's death wasn't his fault. Heavy rain woke them up in the morning, forcing them to pack up and head down quickly. Unfortunately, Dom slipped and injured his knee, slowing them down. Hutch, being the most experienced hiker, checked the map and found a shorter route that could save them a lot of time. However, this route required them to cut through the dense forest. Given Dom's condition, they decided to take this path. Before entering the forest, they came across an abandoned wagon. The forest itself was quite beautiful, so they took a few group photos. But as they ventured deeper, the forest became eerily silent, with no sounds of animals at all. Then, they stumbled upon a horrifying sight. A deer carcass hanging high in the trees, split open with its entrails removed. As night approached and heavy rain began to fall, they decided to set up camp. While looking for a spot to pitch their tent, Luke accidentally discovered a strange symbol carved into a tree. Not far from there, they found an empty cabin. With the rain intensifying, they decided to break into the locked cabin. Luke had a feeling something was following them in the dense forest and pouring rain. But his flashlight revealed nothing. Inside the cabin, they found a necklace hanging on the wall with the same symbol carved into the tree. While checking out the second floor, Phil found something super creepy and called his friends over. They all saw this weird wooden statue that looked like a headless human torso with antlers for hands. Freaked out, they headed downstairs to get the fire going. After they lit the fireplace, they gathered around and talked about their experiences, including ancient Norse beliefs and gods like Odin. Eventually, they all fell asleep. Luke woke up to a bright light shining through the window. His friends were still asleep. He followed the light and opened the door, suddenly finding himself back in the vodka shop, but the vision disappeared as quickly as it came. Luke realized he was outside the cabin, with several stab wounds on his chest forming a strange mark. Confused, he hurried back inside to wake his friends, who were also caught in nightmares. Hutch had even wet his pants, and Dom was in a state of fearful confusion. They found Phil in the attic, naked and kneeling in front of the strange wooden statue. Deciding to leave the cabin and press on, they found more strange symbols carved into the trees outside. Ignoring Hutch's suggestion to head southwest as the map showed, Dom insisted on following a path near the cabin, believing they'd find a settlement there. Despite their worries, his friends reluctantly went along with Dom. Along the way, they stumbled upon another empty cabin, but this time they passed it and continued into the forest. During a break, Luke tried climbing higher ground to survey their surroundings. From above, he spotted a hand gripping a tree in the distance. The hand moved, followed by a shadow as tall as the trees themselves. Luke hurried back to the group in fear. No one believed Luke's story, and Dom accused him of being a coward, even bringing up the incident where Rob died. Luke got angry and punched Dom, but Hutch stepped in and broke up the fight. They continued their journey deeper into the forest. They came across a large footprint resembling a deer's, and the remnants of a tent buried alongside a wallet containing a family photo. Night fell again, forcing them to set up their tents in that spot. Luke woke up to a sound outside the tent. The haunting image of Rob's murder returned, making Luke feel immensely guilty for not being able to help his friend. Then, something was coming, and Luke went inside the tent. Suddenly, a tent was lifted into the air, jolting Luke awake. It had been a nightmare. Luke heard someone screaming. It was Phil. He quickly discovered that Hutch's tent had been torn apart. Something had taken Hutch. Phil said all he saw was shadows taking him. When Luke tried to wake Dom up, they heard another scream, likely Hutch's, followed by a roaring voice. They tried to look for Hutch by following the screams, calling out to him many times but having no response. Dom intervened, warning they were getting lost and needed to return to camp to get their essentials. As dawn approached, they realized they were lost and couldn't remember the location of their camp. They decided to continue their search without a tent and supplies. They arrived at a site where several trees had recently fallen and paused. The scene was so grisly they could hardly believe it. Hutch was hanging from the trees in a gruesome state, his body split open and his entrails spilling out. After laying Hutch to rest, they reluctantly covered his body with a mound of wood. Their journey continued with great difficulty. By a small river, they found several footprints, further convincing them they were not alone in the forest. Did they follow the footprints? If you guessed no, you're right. They were heading southwest, the direction Hutch suggested. Exhausted, Phil and Dom collapsed on the ground. Luke left them behind and tried to climb further up the hill. From there, he realized they were nearing the edge of the forest. In the distance, he saw smoke rising from several campfires. Luke hurried back to his friends to tell them what he had seen. He spotted Phil searching among the trees with his flashlight when suddenly, a large creature snatched Phil from behind the trees. Luke lowered his body to hide. Seeing that they were gone, he tried to escape but bumped his head on a tree and lost consciousness. Memories of the store incident where Rob was killed by a robber flashed through Luke's mind. He rushed out of the store and found his 3 friends waiting outside. The sight of Phil's fallen flashlight brought Luke back to his senses. Luke discovered Dom hiding under a fallen tree trunk, and they quickly joined forces. It appeared the creature was closing in on them. With their last ounces of strength, they attempted to flee, but the creature continued to pursue them. They reached a place where flames lined both sides of the road leading to a cabin. There, they found Phil hanging from a tree, his body impaled by a branch. The sound of the creature drawing nearer compelled them to ignore Phil's body and rush towards the cabin. Exhausted, they collapsed onto the cabin floor. Inside, they encountered a strange altar of worship and Swedish music playing from an old music player. Suddenly, someone appeared and struck them, causing both of them to lose consciousness. Luke woke to the sound of Dom's call, finding themselves both tied up in a closed room. Luke, with a slightly looser chain, attempted to peer through the wooden walls. Outside, several buildings and people were engaged in various activities. Luke tried to use his feet to reach for a bottle to break free. Before he could succeed, however, the door swung open, and an old woman entered accompanied by 2 men. The old woman approached Luke, revealing the same mark that was on his chest. Then, the 2 men forcibly dragged Dom out of the room. Dom screamed in fear, but Luke was powerless to do anything. All Luke could do was listen to Dom's screams of pain as he was tortured on the floor above. A young woman came in and explained they were getting ready for the sacrifice. She covered Luke's ears so he wouldn't hear Dom's screams. Dom, still alive but injured, was brought back into the room. He finally told about his nightmare in the cabin, where he witnessed the people preparing to sacrifice him. As he faced death, he saw his beloved wife, Gail.
I saw my wife.
Dom knew he might not make it, but he hoped Luke could survive and burn the place down. Before they took him away again, he left a message for his wife in case Luke made it out alive. Luke said he didn't need to do that because they could get out of there. The sacrificial ritual began. Dom was taken out of the cabin and tied to a wooden post. As night fell, Dom remained bound while Luke attempted to free him. A roar echoed from the forest, causing the kidnappers to immediately kneel with their faces on the ground, too frightened to look at the creature. Luke was forced to break his fingers to escape from his bonds. Dom was startled because the figure emerging from the trees was not a terrifying creature, but his wife, Gail, walking towards him. It turned out to be Dom's hallucination, as the one holding his face was the dreadful creature. At the same time, Luke finally escaped from his bonds, though he still struggled with a rope around his wrist. He heard Dom call out for Gail and scream. So he peeked out through a small hole. He saw the creature dragging Dom away and pinning him against a tree. While Luke was still processing what was happening, the door opened and the young woman returned. Luke pretended his hands were still tied. When Luke asked about the creature, she explained that it was a godlike figure called a Jotun, the illegitimate child of Loki, a god from Scandinavian mythology. They offered sacrifices to the Jotun in exchange for immortality. She warned Luke that there would be a ritual that night for him to join their group in worshipping the creature. If he refused, Luke would suffer the same fate as his friends, hanging from the trees. After the woman left, Luke freed himself from his bonds and left the dungeon. He climbed up to the top floor of the cabin, where prayers and screams could be heard from behind a closed door. Luke grabbed a lit torch, opened the door, and found a group of living mummies, apparently the result of the immortality granted by their worship of the creature. Following Dom's final wish, Luke set fire to these worshippers. The fire quickly spread through the log cabin. Luke confronted the old woman who suddenly appeared on the stairs and subdued her. The fire at the shrine angered the Jotun, causing it to approach from the forest. Its followers immediately knelt on the ground. Luke found a rifle that still worked and shot a devotee who got in his way. He then took an axe from near a worshipper as an extra weapon. He saw the creature attacking the young woman in a brutal way. As the fire spread more and more, Luke ran to escape from the burning cabin. Before running into the forest, Luke saw the creature lifting the woman's body. He aimed to shoot the creature, but it had no effect. Instead, the creature turned and chased him. Luke dropped the rifle but kept the axe. The hallucinations of being in that alcohol store came back again. Eventually, the creature caught up with Luke, making him fall to the ground. He then saw the sky begin to brighten, signaling that he was close to the forest edge. Luke got up and tried to run, but the creature caught him, lifted him up, forcing him to kneel and worship it. When Luke tried to stand up, it attacked him again. Luke saw Robert looking at him with an axe next to him. Without thinking twice, Luke grabbed the axe and hit the creature, injuring its head and making the Jotun roar in pain. With his last ounce of strength, Luke ran while the creature chased him until he collapsed in an open field. The Jotun stopped under the trees. It seemed Luke had crossed the forest boundary, where the creature was bound and unable to leave. While the Jotun could only roar from a distance, Luke shouted, a mix of triumph and anguish, torn between the happiness of escaping the forest and the sorrow of losing all his best friends. Luke then turned and left the forest.